Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the last one. We are continuing on with Chapter 4 of our book, The Deficit Myth by Dr. Stephanie Kelm. So let's get back into where we left off. So, 2 buckets. When Furman urged lawmakers in 2007 to, quote, stem the flow of red ink, he was worried about a projected fiscal deficit of $198 billion, about 1.5% of GDP. He encouraged Congress to restore pay-go to prevent deficits from climbing any further. He also complained that, quote, the private savings rate was at its lowest level since 1939. In his view, the deficit was, quote, driving down national saving. He had it completely backward. To see why, imagine 2 buckets. One belongs to Uncle Sam, the other belongs to the rest of us. A sort of collective bucket in the name of everyone who is not Uncle Sam. It's a simple way to think about how dollars flow back and forth between these 2 parts of any economy. A government bucket on the one hand, and a non-government bucket on the other. I learned the value of thinking along these lines from Wynne Godley, a British economist who pioneered the sector balance framework. It was 1997, and I had just been awarded a year-long research fellowship that took me to the Levy Economics Institute, a think tank located in New York's Hudson Valley. That's where I met Godley. I was still in graduate school, but I was given the office adjacent to his, and we would sit and talk for hours. Godley was soft-spoken but intense. He played the oboe, often in his office, and had trained to become a professional musician. He had lived most of his life in the UK, where he had performed as the principal oboist in the BBC Welsh Orchestra before directing the Royal Opera from 1976 to 1987. His other professional love was economics. After a long career at the British Treasury, he was persuaded to move to Cambridge University, where he became the head of the Department of Applied Economics. He was a highly regarded figure in British circles, serving as one of the Chancellor of the Exchequer's 7 wise men. He always seemed to be able to anticipate where the economy was headed. The Times of London referred to him as the, quote, the most insightful macroeconomic forecaster of his generation, though often a renegade. 3 years after his death, the New York Times played tribute to his legacy, featuring him in an article entitled, quote, Embracing Wynne Godley, an economist who modeled the crisis. Now, real quick thing, it seems kind of odd to have a guy interested in economics and being an economics professor and working in the British government who is also a musician. I think that's an interesting pair. I don't know what you guys think about that, but I find it kind of fascinating. So I was fortunate to arrive at the Levy Economics Institute just 2 years after Godley took up residency in New York. He was a tall, slender man with wispy white hair that he would tug in frustration as he worked to find the perfect turn of phrase before allowing any of his work to be published. Godley was a macroeconomist, like me, but he was thinking about the economy seemed completely original. He built macro models and used them to analyze the U.S. economy. One morning he invited me to sit with him while he used his model to simulate the effects of an increasing in government spending. Quote, you see, he said, quote, every payment has to come from somewhere, and then it has to go somewhere. Godley was obsessed with building models that didn't leave anything out. He constructed huge matrices with lots of rows and columns in order to connect up all the moving parts in the economy. He told me that it was the only way he could be sure he had accounted for every financial payment as it moved through the system. Each time a payment was made by someone in the economy, it had to be received by someone else. That's what he meant when he said everything had to come from somewhere and go somewhere. He built some pretty sophisticated models, but the one he seemed to find most useful was the one he called his, quote, one equation model of the world. It wasn't like any of the models I had learned about in graduate school. This one didn't depend on conjecture. There were no hidden behavioral assumptions tucked inside. In fact, it wasn't really an economic model at all. It was just a simple accounting identity, true by definition, under all circumstances. We don't need a complicated matrix to understand Godley's most simple model. It has just 2 moving parts, the government's financial balance and ours. Since there are only 2 players in this game, Uncle Sam and everyone else, It stands to reason that every payment the government makes only has one place to go. By the same logic, there's only one place any payment received by the government could have come from. It's a simple but powerful way to think about the way the government's financial balance is surplus or deficit. Impacts the rest of us. It shows why the crowding out story gets it wrong, beginning with the first domino. The equation looks like this. Government financial balance plus non-governmental financial balance equals 0. Because it's not a theory. It doesn't rest on any set of assumptions that might not hold in the real world. It's an ironclad accounting identity that will always produce an accurate statement of fact. You could think of it as a twist on Isaac Newton's third law of motion, which states that, quote, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And the godly model, we can see that for every deficit that exists in one part of the economy, there's an equal and opposite surplus in some other part. There's just no way around it. If one part of the economy is paving out more dollars than it's receiving, the other part must be receiving exactly that many dollars. On the other side of every minus sign lies a plus sign of equal size. Putting the same equation differently, Godley wrote, government deficit equals non-government surplus. It's a most powerful observation, and one that deals a fatal blow to the simple crowding out story. To see why, let's translate Godley's model into an even simpler language. We'll just need 2 buckets. The goal is to look at the part of the crowding out story that claims that government deficits eat up part of our savings. First, let's look at an example of how financial payments move between the 2 parts of our economy. Suppose the government spends $100 on a fleet of new vehicles for the presidential motorcade. The vehicles will be produced by the workers and businesses in the non-government part of the economy. Every dollar the government spends has to go somewhere. And there's only one place those dollars can go, into the non-government bucket. Let's also assume that the rest of us collectively paid the government $90 in the form of taxes. And just to show you here, this is the little chart thing she's showing you guys of how the equation works with her drawn example. So you guys can also get the picture and not just try to have to manage in your head. So if these were the only payments made by and to Uncle Sam, the CBO would report that the government had a run a fiscal deficit, and it would record a minus $10 at its annual budget report. But wait, that's all that happened. The government's fiscal deficit is mirrored by an equal and opposite financial surplus in the non-government part of our economy. Uncle Sam's red ink is our black ink. His deficit is our financial surplus. Just follow the money. $100 goes into our bucket, $90 goes back out to pay taxes. $10 is left in our bucket. Every fiscal deficit makes a financial contribution to the non-government bucket. Godley was a stickler for details. His models were, as he put it, stock flow consistent. It's a fancy way of saying that all the financial contribution that flowed into our bucket over time would exactly match the stockpile of dollar assets we must end up accumulating. In other words, every financial outflow had to become a financial inflow. And over time, those flows must accumulate into corresponding stocks of financial assets. To grasp the point, think of your bathtub. Water flows into the tub when you turn on the faucet, and water flows out of the tub when you drop in the drain. If the water is draining at least as fast as it's flowing in, the tub will never accumulate any standing water. But if you add water faster than you siphon it away, the water level will rise as the bathtub begins to fill. That's what's happening in Exhibit 3. The government is letting $100 flow into our bucket and only siphoning $90 down the drain. The flow of red ink laminated by Jason Furman fills our bucket with dollars. Fiscal deficits don't eat up our savings, they enlarge them. If Uncle Sam continues to deficit spend at this pace, he will drop another $10 into our bucket every year. Over time, those dollars will accumulate and build up our financial wealth. At this pace, a decade from now, we'll end up with a stockpile of $100 in our bucket. We'll get to the borrowing in just a bit. But first, Let's consider what would happen if Congress had followed Furman's advice. Eliminating budget deficits and running its budget on a pay-go basis is shown down here on Exhibit 4. If you guys can see that, that's what she's taught. That's the graph that she had put in here. And that's just how the math and everything adds up from the chart. So by holding its spending in line with taxes, the dreaded red ink is eliminated. But what's this? The non-government bucket has lost its financial surplus. Now, it's possible that this is a good outcome. Remember, MMT asks us to focus on economic outcomes, not budgetary outcomes. So if a budget balance can deliver good overall conditions in our economy, that is, full employment and price stability, then there's no reason to complain that the government has balanced its books. Most of the time, however, our economy will need the support of fiscal deficits to keep things in balance. The trick is to prevent the deficit from getting too big or too small. As we learned in Chapter 2, spending too much or taxing too little can lead to problems. Imagine an extreme scenario where the government allowed us to keep every dollar it put into our bucket, never taxed anything out anyway. That's like closing the drain in the bathtub and letting every drop of spending accumulate in our bucket. Before long, the tub would overfill, and our economy would overheat. Inflation would quickly take hold as too much money sloshed around in our bucket. The right-sized deficit is the one that provides just enough support to keep our economy humming along without rising inflation. Deficits can be too big, but they can be also too small. We can use our two buckets to look, one last time, at the much-celebrated Clinton surpluses 1998 to 2001. Prior to 98, the government had been running persistent deficits. Then suddenly, the situation reversed itself. Instead of dollars flowing from Uncle Sam's bucket to ours, they started moving in the opposite direction. As Exhibit 5 shows, Uncle Sam got the plus sign, and we got the minus sign. We can illustrate this using simple numbers. To put Uncle Sam in surplus, the government had to tax away more dollars, 100, than it spent, 90. Into our bucket in 1998. The only way for Uncle Sam to collect more dollars than he currently spends is to take back some of the dollars he supplied with us in prior years. So here's the other chart she's talking about for you to kind of get a look at what she's trying to explain here. So, throughout the economy, tax cuts that go disproportionately to the biggest corporations and the wealthiest people in our society funnel riches into their buckets, while millions of families struggle to keep their boats afloat. If the goal is broadly shared prosperity, then we need fiscal deficits that channel resources more equitably. For example, investing in healthcare, education, and public infrastructure won't just benefit the medical professionals, teachers, and construction workers who get paid to do those jobs. It will also benefit the patients, students, and drivers who benefit from better public services. And when fiscal deficits help low and middle-income families, those dollars aren't hoarded in offshore bank accounts. They get spent back into the economy, helping to lift the boats that belong to the families like theirs. The point is not every deficit serves the broader public good. Deficits can be used for good or evil. They can enrich a small segment of the population, lifting the odds of the rich and powerful to new heights, while leaving millions behind. They can fund unjust wars that destabilize the world and cost millions of lives. They can be used to sustain life and build a more just economy that works for the many and not just the few. What they can't do is eat up our collective savings. The interest rate is a policy variable. The crowding out story is rooted out in the TABS model we introduced in Chapter 1. Remember, that model treats Uncle Sam as a currency user who must finance his expenditures either by taxing or borrowing. If he wishes to spend S more than he expects to collect in taxes, T, then he must cover the dollar shortfall, i.e. the deficits, by borrowing B. According to conventional economists, hawks and doves alike, if the government borrows to cover deficits, then it will use up some of the savings that would otherwise have been available to private companies and other borrowers. The story continues: if the supply of savings is reduced, then interest rates will rise as borrowers complete for a dwindling pool of available funding, driving borrowing costs higher. We have already shown that deficit spending increases our collective savings. But what happens if Uncle Sam borrows when he runs a deficit? Is that what eats up a savings and forces interest rates higher? The answer is no. The financial crowding out story asks us to imagine that there's a fixed supply of savings from which anyone can attempt to borrow. Picture an enormous amount of US dollars sitting in some corner of the world. Now imagine that those dollars are put in there by savers. People who have dollars but don't wish to spend everything they have. Savers make those funds available to borrowers, but only at a price. Savers get interest on the money they lend, while borrowers pay savers for the use of those funds. It's a straightforward supply and demand story, where the interest rates balance the demand for funding against this available supply. In the absence of government deficits, all demand comes from private borrowers. There's still competition for these loanable funds, but companies are just competing with other private sector actors for a slice of the available supply. With no competition from Uncle Sam, all savings are used to finance private investment. But if the government's budget moves into deficit, Uncle Sam will lay claim to some of that cash. As a consequence, the supply of funds available to private investment is diminished, borrowing goes up, and some companies are left without financing for their projects. It's not government deficits, per se, but deficits financed by borrowing, though, that supposedly leads to crowding out via higher interest rates. MMT rejects the loanable fund story, which is rooted in the idea that borrowing is limited by access to scarce financial reserves. As MMT economist Scott Fulwiler put it, the conventional, quote, analysis is simply inconsistent with how the modern financial system actually works. To see why, let's take a closer look at what's actually happening when the federal government sells bonds in coordination with its deficit spending. Since MMT recognizes that the federal government doesn't operate its budget like a household, we reject the TABS model and use the currency issuer's STAB model instead. Remember, this model recognizes that the government is not revenue constrained, like a household, so it can spend first and then tax or borrow. Suppose Congress authorizes $100 in new spending. As the government begins making payments, those dollars flow into the non-government bucket. Let us again assume that $90 is used to pay taxes. And here's Exhibit 6, if you guys can see that there. That's what she's referring to. The government's deficit deposits $10 in the non-government bucket. If that's all that happened, those dollars would simply sit in the form of digital or fiscal currency. Green dollars. Recall our use of green dollars from Chapter 1. Green dollars exist in the form of bank reserves or notes and coins. If the government simply left us holding green dollars, it could run a fiscal deficit without the selling the government bonds that end up adding up to the thing we, unfortunately, call the national debt. But that's not the way things currently work. Under current arrangements, the government sells U.S. Treasuries whenever it runs a fiscal deficit. This is normally referred to as borrowing, but we learned in Chapter 3 that is very much a misnomer. That's because the government's own deficit supplies the dollars that are needed to purchase the bonds. To match the $10 with bond sales, the government simply pulls 10 green dollars out of our bucket and recycles them into yellow dollars. U.S. Treasuries. Now, Exhibit 7, which I'll show here in a minute, shows the government removing green dollars for the non-government bucket and replacing them with interest-bearing government bonds. That's the one she's talking about here. The little image of the recycling symbol kind of showing how the money's recycled from, as she says, green dollars to yellow dollars, and around we go. So while the whole process is over, Uncle Sam will have spent S, $100 into our bucket, and taxed 90, T, back out, and transformed the remaining $10 into yellow dollars called U.S. Treasury bonds, B. Those bonds are now parts of the wealth that is held by savers at home and around the world. As Godley's model reveals, government deficits always lead to a dollar-for-dollar increase in the supply of net financial assets held in the non-governmental bucket. That's not a theory. That's not an opinion. It's just the cold hard reality of stock flow consistent accounting. So fiscal deficits, even with government borrowing, can't leave behind a similar supply of dollar savings. And if that can't happen, then a shrinking pool of dollars savings can't be responsible for driving borrowing costs higher. Clearly, this presents a problem for the conventional crowding out theory, which claims that government spending and private investment compete for a finite pool of savings. The reason the loanable fund story is not in sync with reality is that it asks us to treat the federal government like a currency user. When we reject this naive lens, we see that countries like the US aren't dependent on borrowing to fund themselves, nor are they at the mercy of private investors when they do sell bonds. Uncle Sam is not a beggar. We must go in hand and search for funding to support his desired spending. He's a muscular currency issuer. He could choose to borrow or not, and Congress can always decide what rate of interest it will pay on the bonds it decides to offer. That's not true of all countries, but it is true of those with monetary sovereignty. And like she mentioned in the first couple chapters, and I have brought this up as well, that, like the United States, Japan, and originally the UK as well, they had their own monetary sovereignty where we can print as much money as we want. We don't have to worry about borrowing that money. I mean, we could, but we don't have to actually worry about borrowing money or asking, for example, the European Union. All these European countries are part of the EU, they're all relying on the euro. Well, they can't just print that money. They have to go ask for it. And they have to use it in their budget. But if they weren't part of it, they would have monetary dependence. But again, it depends on the way the actual country is structured and their government and how the economic market works, which I'm not too, familiarized with. I mean, I did take a class in college on the European Union, how European politics kind of works, but not, the ins and outs of the economic stuff. But that's kind of what she's referencing to. The distinction is incredibly important, for there is an element of truth in the conventional narrative that the budget deficits can force interest rates higher. But we must be careful in telling that story. By focusing on the monetary arrangements and the actual mechanics of deficit financing, MMT helps us avoid an overly simplistic theory about how this can happen. What matters most is the currency regime under which the country is operating. Unlike Greece, Venezuela, or Argentina, countries with monetary sovereignty are not at the mercy of financial markets. To see why, let's take a closer look at what happens when a monetary sovereign like the US runs a fiscal deficit. MMT shows that the US government spends by crediting the reserve balances of private banks, which in turn credits the bank accounts of those receiving payments from the government. If you deposit a $1,000 check from Uncle Sam, your bank will get a $1,000 credit to its reserve account at the Federal Reserve, and you will get a $1,000 credit to your own personal bank account. Payments made by you to the federal government have the opposite effect. For example, if you write a $500 check to pay your federal income taxes, your bank will subtract that much from your current balance, and the Fed will subtract $500 from your bank's reserve balance. When the government is spending more than it taxes away, it leaves the banking system with a larger quantity of reserve balances. In other words, fiscal deficits increase the aggregate supply of reserve balances. What happened next depends entirely on the policy response. The government might borrow, as it does today, replacing the newly created reserve balances with U.S. Treasuries. Doing this allows the government to run fiscal deficits without altering the quantity of reserves in the banking system. From MMT perspective, the purpose of selling bonds is not to, quote, finance government expenditures, which have already taken place, but to prevent a large infusion of reserves from pushing the overnight interest rate below the Fed's target level. Selling bonds is entirely voluntary in the sense that Congress could always decide to do things differently. Because as monetary sovereignty, the U.S. has many options when it comes to borrowing and managing its interest rate. It could exert rigid control of the short-term interest rate, but allow financial markets to have some influence on long-term borrowing costs. That's how it works in the U.S. today. Or it could take control of long-term borrowing costs, the way it did during and immediately after World War II, or the way the Bank of Japan, BOJ, does today. It could even dispense with treasuries altogether, which would make it all but impossible for anyone to tell a crowding out story based on this argument that government borrowing is what drives interest rates higher. The point is, deficit poses no inherent crowd out risk. The loanable funds theory is simply wrong. Fiscal deficits, with or without bond sales, does not mean inevitable increasing in interest rates. To understand why, let's take a brief look at how it all works today. The U.S. Treasury issues what are known as risk-free securities. Whenever it runs a fiscal deficit, the securities are considered risk-free in the sense that a currency-issuing government can always make good on any promise to repay bondholders as long as the bonds are denominated in the government's own unit of account. Japan can always repay yen. The U.S. can always repay U.S. dollars. And the British government can always meet a payment obligation denominated in British pounds. To each of these countries, and others, the federal government has adopted its own procedures for placing government bonds in the hands of private buyers. The rest relies on an auction system to sell bonds into the private market. Whenever the federal government is expected to run a fiscal deficit, the Treasury Department offers a quantity of government securities that matches the anticipated deficit. Treasury officials decide how many securities to offer, and market participants, that is, investors, compete for the limited supply. The initial sale takes place in what's known as the primary market, where a certain category of buyers, called primary dealers, bid for the securities. Primary dealers are defined as trading counterparties of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. There are currently 24 primary dealers, including familiar names like Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and Citigroup. After their initial purchase in the primary market, U.S. Treasuries can change hands in the secondary market. That's where they become available to pensions, hedge funds, state and local governments, insurance companies, foreign investors, and others. The interest rate on government bonds comes out of the competitive bidding process as primary dealers, quote, make the market by tendering bids for the entire supply at each auction. If the government expects to run a fiscal deficit of $200 billion, the Treasury Department will arrange an auction for that amount. Before each auction, Treasury officials decide the auction date, how big the auction will be, the face value of the securities, and which maturities to offer. As part of the $200 billion auction, officials might offer a block of 10-year treasuries, with face value of $1,000 each. When auction opens, each primary dealer bids for its share of the total allotment. One of them might signal a willingness to buy a certain number of bonds, but only if they pay out $20 per year. Another primary dealer might ask for $18, and still another might submit a bid seeking $22 per year. Each bid carries an implied rate of return. In this example, primary dealers are seeking 2%, 1.8%, and 2.2%, respectively. If the primary dealer is seeking $20 wins a piece of the auction, the Federal Reserve will charge them the appropriate number of bank reserves and credit them with the Treasury bonds. That will pay out 2% interest rate in each of the next 10 years. After 10 years, each of these bonds will have paid out $200 of interest income. Primary dealers are required to bid at reasonable rates, but they don't have to submit identical bids. If they think 2% is too low, they can try to go higher yield by submitting a weaker bid. However, weaker bids reduce the likelihood of winning the auction. There's an old trick that will help you understand the relationship between bond yields, interest rates, and bond prices. Using your thumbs, give a thumbs up for the strong demand for investors. Strong bids mean strong prices. Go thumbs up. There's an inverse relationship between bond prices and bond yields. So a thumbs up for higher bond prices implies a thumbs down for interest rates. It's cheaper to borrow when primary dealers indicate a willingness to buy at low interest rates. When dealers submit weaker bids, it means they're asking for higher returns. If the weakness is widespread, the Treasury Department may end up paying somewhat more than anticipated when the auction was announced. In practice, Treasury auctions are always oversubscribed, meaning that there are always more bids than there are securities to go around. As former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Frank Newman wrote to me, quote, there is always more demand for treasuries than can be allocated from a limited supply of new issues in each auction. The winners in the auctions get to place their funds in the safest, most liquid form of instrument there is for U.S. dollars. The losers are stuck keeping some other funds and banks, with bank risk. Since demand always tends to exceed supply, submitting a relatively weak bid means you're likely to walk away empty-handed. The most enthusiastic bidders get to swap some of their reserves balances for U.S. Treasuries. To separate the winners from the losers, the government ranks the bids from highest to lowest. The outright strongest bid, that is, the lowest interest rate, always wins. The next allotment goes to the next highest bidder, and so on, down the line until the entire amount is sold. This might sound like the loanable funds market imagined in the crowd-out story. It's not. The primary dealer market is a real-world market, established by the federal government for the purpose of dealing exclusively in newly issued government securities. In other words, the government created the primary dealer market for the sole purpose of placing U.S. Treasuries in private hands as part of its fiscal operations. Uncle Sam doesn't enter the market in a competition with other borrowers. On the contrary, it's the 24 primary dealers, lenders, who compete with one another to win a piece of the auction. Every auction involves coordination between the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. This means that even large, unanticipated fiscal deficits never pose any kind of financial problem. That's because the Fed backstops the primary dealers. Backstopping basically means that if there's ever any hiccup in the process, the Fed makes sure the primary dealers have all the funding they require to make it profitable for them to place reasonable bids for the entire allotment. With these arrangements in place, it's clear that interest rates on government bonds are a policy choice, and not something imposed on the federal government by lenders. So, what is the relationship between deficits and interest rates? In one prospect, that's an indisputable answer. Deficits push the overnight interest rates down, in a world without bonds or sales. Some other defensive action by the central bank, deficits would drive the short-term interest rate to zero. That's because deficit spending fills the banking system with excess reserves, and a huge increase in the supply of reserves will push the federal funds rate to zero. If the central bank doesn't want to accept the zero rate, then it must do something to move the rate into positive territory. Historically, pre-2008, it did this by performing open market operations, selling U.S. Treasuries and draining bank reserve balances until the interest rate rose to the Fed's target. Today, the Fed hit its interest rate target by proclamation. If it wants to adjust interest rates, it simply announces a new target and voila! The interest rate is now set at the new higher or lower level. The point is that without some explicit form of intervention, fiscal deficits would naturally drive the short-term interest rate to zero. What about the other interest rates? Being a primary dealer is sort of like owning the goose that laid the golden egg. You're guaranteed a profit simply for occupying a special place in the monetary apparatus that facilitates the U.S. Treasury's financial operations. It's a privileged position that no primary dealer wants to jeopardize. To remain in good standing, all they have to do is present reasonable bids that win the share of treasuries at each auction. Reasonably is the key word. It means that dealers need to submit bids that come in very close to current exchange rates, which are themselves largely governed by Federal Reserve policy. So while primary dealers formally submit bids that express their desired rate of return, the interest rate they must ultimately accept is largely beyond their control. This miss is even more obvious when you look around the world and realize that roughly 1/3 of the global government bond market trades at negative, normal, rates of interest. That's because the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, Sweden's Riksbank, the National Bank of Denmark, and the Swiss National Bank have all the short-term interest rates below zero. Selling bonds to private investors gives the illusion, that the government is dependent on savers for financing, and that financial markets can force the government to borrow on terms set by private lenders. That's not how it works in practice. A currency-issuing government doesn't need to borrow its own currency from anyone in order to spend. And even if it does borrow, it can exert substantial influence over the interest rate it pays on those securities. Primary dealers can signal a desire for higher rates, but the Fed can always manage rates lower if it chooses to do so. There's a popular saying among savvy investors, quote, "Don't fight the Fed." If the Fed is determined to bring rates down, it's best to prepare for falling interest rates. Investors who bet against a determined central bank are virtually guaranteed to suffer financial losses. One of the most high-profile bad trade wars carried out by an investor named Kyle Bass. Bass felt certain that the Japanese government debt had become unsustainable, so he bet against it by shorting JGBs. When an investor shorts government bonds, they're betting that the price of the bonds is going up to go down. Price thumbs up. The price thumbs down. And the yield, interest rate thumbs up. It's going to go up. Bass and others like him lost huge sums of money with this trading strategy. Shorting JGBs became known as the Widowmaker's trade because few investors survived the resulting losses. In spite of what most economists say, there's simply no preordained relationship between fiscal deficits and interest rates. If the central bank is committed to holding rates in place or managing them lower, the fiscal deficits can't force them to rise as the conventional crowding out story imagines. A little history will prove the point. From 1942 until 1947, the Federal Reserve, at the behest of the Treasury Department, actively managed the government's borrowing costs. Even as spending to fight World War II drove the federal deficit to more than 25% of GDP in 1943. Interest rates trended lower. That's because the Fed pegged the T-bill rate at 0.375% lower. That's because and held that rate on 25-year bonds at 2.5%. As MMT economist L. Randall Wray put it, quote, "The government can borrow. Issue bonds to the public." Alright guys, I'm ending here and I'll be back next time.